My name's Sarah Denny. I am the chair of the Cultural Events and Outreach Committee, which is sponsoring this event. I have worked with two individuals, Susie Welch and Mark Byington, to bring this together, and I am going to let Mark Byington, criminal justice professor, come and tell you guys about today's event. So it's all you.
Thank you. We welcome all of you here. This, what we hope, is the first of many, or an annual event looking at violence in our society. People are asking about where it came about, but it came about with all the situations that have been going on, not just in the last 6 to 8 months, but even just most recently this last week in our own community with the unfortunate abuse of a child. So violence reaches out to all of us. So that's where this came about. Susie and I had a discussion at the beginning of the fall semester, and as it progressed, Sarah got involved, and this is where we're at now. We call it the Ripple of Hope from Violence to Peace, and it's a project. So as a project, we hope that it's ongoing. It's not an event. We hope to see it spring into many other things addressing violence. The reason for Ripple of Hope is you'll see the documentary is called A Ripple of Hope, and it's the situation or the day around the events of Dr. King's assassination and Senator Robert Kennedy's very famous speech that night and what came about from there. So with that said, before I go into the schedule, I'd like to welcome, before I welcome our special guest, a couple of the people in the audience. Our former president of the college, Bill McKenna, is here. So thank you for coming. Greg Underwood. There he is. Our trustee, as well as Ron Skaggs, who's graciously here as well. And a very special guest who will be speaking afterwards, who's graciously flew in and has spent a couple days with us here, is Mr. Adam Walensky. For those of you who aren't familiar with Adam, he was our Attorney General Robert Kennedy's aide in the Department of Justice, and then went to become his aide and speechwriter during his days as a senator as well as the presidential campaign. I know him and have worked with him for almost 2 decades now. A program that some of you may be familiar with, I know Ron is, called Police Corps. And he is the creator and founder of Police Corps. And that is basically what we've been doing within the understanding of police training for the last 2 decades. Adam will be speaking afterwards, and actually he had said right before we started what he hopes to do, because a lot of what he says about that day will be on the documentary. But he's going to be gracious enough to answer questions and actually propose questions to you after the documentary. So as a student of his, I would say pay close attention. So there will be a quiz afterwards, if you might want to say. Shirley, who has spent some time with Adam, can vouch for that. So, the schedule, we will begin with the documentary after this welcoming part. And then we're going to have a brief discussion with Adam, and then there'll be a small group breakout sessions, which we have our facilitators, which we'll introduce after Adam talks with all of you. And then we'll go to the individual rooms for small discussions regarding one specific question that we'll look at afterwards, that all of us will then come back after the small group discussions to come back into what we call the town hall meeting. So we'll take all those ideals and bring them back into the larger room so that when we leave here today, all of us leave with a number of ideals that we hope can be put in place to address the violence in our society. So with that, we're going to start with the documentary.
The following is a Heartland Truly Moving Picture Award winner.
It started out as a normal day in a campaign that you'd done 100 times. Make a speech, work the crowd. In a matter of just It seemed like minutes. It went to hell.
This is an NBC News Hotline special report. Here is Don Hickman in Memphis.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot outside a Memphis motel this afternoon. His condition is not known at this time.
At the airport in Muncie, somebody rushed up and told us that King had been shot.
Kennedy just looked stunned. His eyes were kind of lifeless.
And the question then arose is, what about the rally at 17th and Broadway?
Police kept saying there's going to be problems, there's going to be trouble. There's a huge crowd up there.
Did they know about Martin Luther King?
To some extent. We have left it up to you.
Robert Kennedy, I think, understood that he had an obligation to come and speak. And he came and he spoke. And it was Robert Kennedy that informed us. Martin Luther King Jr. meant everything to the African American community. This young man had emerged as a leader, as a fighter, as a warrior for change. To end segregation, to end racial discrimination, and to lead America into a different direction, to create what he liked to call the beloved community.
He gave black people hope. We didn't have any hope when I was a kid growing up. The Ku Klux Klan was running crazy over here in Muncie, doing anything they wanted to do, treating black people any way they wanted to treat them. Couldn't swim in the public swimming pool. You couldn't sit on the first floor of a theater in Muncie. You couldn't be served at a restaurant. Muncie was a terrible place for black people. But our parents paid taxes just like anybody else, and that pisses me off.
Segregation was real. You could taste the bitter fruits of racism. I saw those signs that said white men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. People could not register to vote, for the most part, in 11 states of the old Confederacy, from Virginia to Texas. Dr. King changed that.
The long-anticipated Freedom March from Selma to Alabama's capital of Montgomery finally gets underway as Dr. Martin Luther King addresses the crowd at the starting point.
He gave us hope. He taught us the way of love, the way of peace, the way of nonviolence. He freed me. He liberated me. He freed our nation. He liberated us all. Martin Luther King Jr. went to Memphis. There were people in need, people in trouble. They needed some help. And in doing so, he literally put his life on the line.
And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
I think he saw something or felt something that others maybe didn't feel or didn't see. It was sort of like a farewell address to his followers, to the people of the movement, and to the nation.
Robert Kennedy, in my view, was a very complex individual.
He was a very emotional person that was manifested sometimes in anger, hostility, but also in empathy.
He had the capacity, in my estimation, to bring people together. It really didn't matter whether they were black, white, Hispanic, Native American, Asian American. He identified with all of us. In spite of growing up rich, he was still one of us.
He was never afraid of the truth. Most human beings spend our whole lives ignoring, concealing, pretending we don't know, trying desperately to forget the facts because they're too uncomfortable. Robert Kennedy never fled from the facts. He also knew, in ways that politicians these days seem to have no understanding, not the faintest idea, that truth is the token of trust.
I look around this audience here today, and I don't see very many black faces of men who are going to become doctors. The fact is, the poor also have a very, very difficult time even entering your profession.
It was his view of a political leader's function to tell them the truth, even though it made them uncomfortable, even though it may have made them dislike him, and even though it may have cost him in that audience.
Thank you very much.
Robert Kennedy saw his success as secondary to the benefit and success of the country and the people in it.
Kennedy was on a committee that was holding hearings investigating hunger in the Mississippi Delta. Kennedy asked to be shown some of the sharecroppers' shacks. And so he and Peter Edelman and Marion Wright, they go to Cleveland, Mississippi, and they go in and out of these sharecroppers' shacks, meeting people and talking to them.
Robert Kennedy talked to them where there was nothing in the refrigerator, where they had running sores on their legs and arms that would not heal, diseases that we thought didn't exist in America. And then there was this scene that Marion and I happened to witness where Robert Kennedy went into a home by himself.
The house is dark and it smells of mildew and urine, and there's a small girl who is on the floor playing listlessly with a single grain of rice.
Baby was unable to stand up. Must have been 2 years old.
He leans down and he starts to stroke her and to whisper and to say, hi baby, and talk to her.
And he tried for about 5 minutes to get the attention, to get some response from the child.
With tears streaming down his cheeks, he picks her up in his arms and begins to rock her.
And it just happened that Marion and I had walked into the house and saw that, and she really decided right then and there that he was for real.
He had a moral imagination, and that meant that when he looked at that girl, he could imagine his own children being that child.
He went home that night and he said to his children, what I saw today was unacceptable. You have to do something.
Robert Kennedy was incredibly divided against himself on whether to run for the presidency or not in 1968. On the one hand, he was afraid that if he did run, he'd destroy the party, he'd tear the party apart. He also thought it might be the death of his own political career if he immolated, basically, and didn't have a chance to come back, say, in 1972.
I advised him not to run, strongly advised him not to run. Lyndon Johnson was president of the United States. It was impossible to unseat a sitting president.
He decided not to run, and he expressed this in a supposedly off-the-record conversation at a press breakfast in Washington.
Somebody asked him if he were going to run for president. And he said, I will not run under any conceivable circumstance. And then I said, maybe we should make that any foreseeable circumstance. And he looked at me and said, yes, I guess that's right.
And of course, the next day is the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, a great psychological blow to the Johnson administration and to American policy in Vietnam, more so than a military blow, because it shows that all of the optimism of the last couple of years about that we were seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, that escalating the war was finally going to win it, it shows that it's just not true. Then at the end of February, the Kerner Commission issues its report. In the famous line, talks about America becoming two societies, one black and one white, and makes some very serious recommendations about what can be done to do what Kennedy has said he would like to do in his campaign, which is to reconcile the races, to put an end to this estrangement between black and white that has led to these riots. Johnson ignores it. In fact, he won't even meet with the members of the Kerner Commission, and he won't even accept a bound copy of it. And Kennedy, this is the final straw. He remarks that Johnson's not going to do anything about Vietnam, and he's not going to do anything about the cities either.
Lyndon Johnson lived in fear of the Kennedys. He had nightmares about them. It was bad enough when Lyndon Johnson nearly lost to Eugene McCarthy in New Hampshire, in the New Hampshire primary with a strong anti-war vote. But then when Bobby Kennedy got in the race, it was like Johnson's worst nightmare had been realized, that Kennedys were coming back to get him. And Johnson essentially said to hell with it. He wasn't going to take the country through this. He wasn't going to take himself through it. And so he got out.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
We were just getting into every primary that was possible. In those days, there were very few primaries.
And we organized this big rally in front of the State House. The Indianapolis Star, we learned not to pay too much attention to during that campaign, but the estimates, even by the Star, was that there were 10,000 people there. So he makes his way through this crowd, comes into the State House, and I had the petitions and handed them to him, and he officially filed.
He has just started his Indiana campaign, which is a campaign he must win. If he loses Indiana, he's finished.
April the 4th was an eventful day because I think it was the first day that the campaign really kicked off in Indiana. And the plan for that day had the senator in South Bend giving a speech at Notre Dame.
The senator and the press group went on to Muncie to give a speech there, and we just went directly to Indianapolis because there was a lot of work to do preparing for other speeches and appearances.
There was a political charge in the air. We were able to get sort of an escort because there were other press people who also wanted to get the shots and the photos. And we got to the Ball Gym, and the place was packed, absolutely packed.
We were probably there an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours prior to that, because I knew it was going to be crowded, and I told my wife, let's go so we can get good seats. I think it was built to hold 7,000 people, and they probably had 10,000 in there.
African-American student, back of the crowd, up in a sort of contesting, a little bit of a challenging, a little bit of a confronting way.
All right.
I agree with the program and proposal that you are making.
Thank you. Can you stop just there?
But in order for them to work, you're placing a great deal of faith in white America. My question is this faith justified?
Yes. I think that there are white people who say that they are concerned about black people and that the black people are inferior and therefore they don't want to treat them as equal. That is a small minority of the white people, and I think the vast majority of American people want to do the decent and the right thing here within our country.
What made it eerie then is that it was about that time when Martin Luther King was being assassinated.
I was in my car and turned the car radio on, and that's when I heard that Dr. King had been shot.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot outside a Memphis motel this afternoon. His condition is not known at this time. Police put out a wanted bulletin for, quote, a young white male, well-dressed, who was seen running from a brick building across the street from the Lorraine Hotel.
I cursed this country. I just angry at America and all the lies that they tell about this is a land of opportunity for all people and everybody is treated equal under the law and all that bullshit. That's what had me angry.
Getting on the plane, somebody rushed up and told us that King had been shot. Didn't know if he was dead or alive.
Kennedy just looked stunned. His eyes were kind of lifeless, as if he was sort of just taking it all in.
Robert Kennedy knew he was dead somehow. You can see in that picture, I think, in his eyes that he knew it.
In the plane, he turns to someone he's sitting next to and says, to think that I just told that kid, that white Americans, want to do the right thing.
We talked about what we would do. Should we call off the appearance in Indianapolis? And we decided, no, let's wait and see what happens to King, first of all. So on the plane,
He and I talked, for the whole ride, about what he should say, assuming that King had been killed. And then he said to me, well, write some of this down. Give me some sentences, some ideas. We don't have much time. Write it down and then give it to me. So I wrote, and it's one of the great undelivered speeches of all time. And then, of course, when we got to the airport in Indianapolis, we found out that King had indeed been killed.
And the reporters who were sitting near him at the time say that the reaction was just painful to watch, that he turned white. One person says that his head jerked backwards as if he'd been hit by a bullet himself. And they all realize that, of course, he's thinking about his brother's death.
My job was whenever Ethel came into town, I went with the driver to pick her up. So we went out and the turmoil was already going on. We knew kind of something was wrong. There was police everywhere, which was very unusual.
I was in touch with campaign headquarters in Washington, D.C. I have a note from that night, which I wrote to myself, which basically says that Washington was suggesting that everything be canceled out of respect for Dr. King, and that a statement should be issued along those lines, and to make sure there was no indication given that there was any concern about the security of Robert Kennedy. I went on board and told the senator and around what people in Washington had thought. And the question then arose is, what about the rally at 17th and Broadway?
And there were some people saying, maybe, just maybe, Robert Kennedy shouldn't come and speak. And I took the position that he had to come.
Robert Kennedy told me that everyone thought he should not go. The one exception to that was John Lewis, who was there and who had called.
The senator made the decision. He says, we're going.
There were high-ranking police officers out there, and there was an argument. They were saying there's going to be problems, there's going to be trouble, there's a huge crowd up there. Those people don't know yet. You know, comments like, if something happens, you know, you guys brought it on. Then Robert got off the plane and he walked Ethel over to the car. She said something to him, and I believe she kissed him. And he talked to her. I know the word love was in the conversation because I heard that. He shut the door and said, stay with her. And I said, yes, sir, I will. The police were getting fairly firm and somewhat loud about he didn't need to go up there. Robert said, I could go up there with my family and go to sleep in the street and no one would bother me. And if they would bother you, then you're the one with the problem.
It was packed. We were packed shoulder to shoulder and standing one in front of the other. My impression is that most of them didn't know what had happened. They were still coming to hear a campaign speech by Robert Kennedy.
There were essentially two crowds there. One was the crowd of Kennedy supporters who'd come early, who were closer to the platform, and that crowd had more white people in it than the outer crowd, because there weren't going to be a lot of white people who are going to come to a Kennedy rally in a black neighborhood after they've learned that Martin Luther King has been assassinated by a white man. That second crowd knew what had happened, and it had some angry young black militants in it.
People just wanted to just go out there and destroy the white man. Fight, you know, they just, I mean, just that natural instinct that you think when something like that happens, and you hear about it. And people just get upset, and at that first moment, they just think, let's go do this, let's go burn, let's go destroy them, because, you know, because King don't deserve that.
And as the researchers from Purdue, who interviewed people, I believe about a month later, point out, the white people who were in this crowd were potentially at risk.
There they were, innocently awaiting a performance by a politician,
and being confronted without provocation by black individuals. What are you doing here, whitey? Why don't you get out of here, you white son of a bitch?
I was thinking, Jiminy, you know, they shot the president and they shot Dr. Martin Luther King, and here's a guy, Senator Kennedy, that's out saying a lot of stuff that a lot of people don't want to hear. Back then, the candidates didn't get the Secret Service protection.
He had one former FBI agent who was an excellent security man, but he resisted anything that would intrude upon his reaching the people.
The mayor of Indianapolis was Richard Lugar, Republican. He didn't want us to have the rally, and he kept saying it would lead to riots, that every major city was either having riots or was afraid they were going to have them. And Mayor Lugar said, if you can't get them to back off, then I'm going to send fire trucks, and I'm going to run fire hoses across all roads, and I'm going to have police officers there, and I'm not going to let anybody come in to that area. The senators said to call Lugar and tell him to go to hell. We're going to have this rally.
When the word came that Martin Luther King had been shot, I was having dinner in the hotel restaurant, and right away I knew the potential for large-scale national violence was clearly there. We knew the senator would go directly there, and whatever he was planning to say before was going to have to be drastically redone. So we went out, there was a car that the campaign had, and John drove, and I was sitting in the passenger seat frantically trying to write some thoughts on a yellow pad. We were stopped by a police car.
Gotta talk to you guys.
And the police told us not to go any further because this was getting into the ghetto and there was going to be violence. So I think we might have said, well, why don't you come along? Oh, no, they said, we're not going to do that. Actually, it was probably a wise decision because it might have been more of a provocation than actually any kind of security.
The motorcade started off and we were going to the speech. Ethel that night, I think all she did after she talked to Robert at the car, all the time I was with her, was prayed. And we got to the speech, and then Ethel never got out of the car. As we were pulling in, staff come over and said, the senator wants you to take her back to the hotel and stay with her until we get back. And when we got back to the hotel, she was concerned about him and whether he was going to be all right up there.
During this drive, he hardly speaks at all. He's scribbles some notes on the back of an envelope or something, a piece of paper. And he only speaks, at one point he says to Fred Dutton, what do you think I should say? So he's still making up his mind.
I couldn't count the crowd, but I think it would have been in the low thousands. Overwhelmingly, of course, black.
I got caught up in the crowd. Do you know what that's like? I can't explain it to anybody. I mean, they walked me. I was not trying to go in the park for any rallies to see where we were gonna burn or whatever. They walked me into the park. You could smell gas, and people had chains and guns and knives and all this stuff, and I'm thinking, where are they going? It was crazy. I was so terrified.
Senator was arriving in a car, and the press bus was right behind him. As I jumped out of the car with my papers in my hand, I went running up saying, Senator, and holding it out. And he just made a gesture. Now, it's something as if I've got it. And he pulled out of his pocket, of his overcoat pocket, he pulled out some yellow sheets. And he was sort of looking at that as he kept walking, didn't stop.
And there was this flatbed truck with very shaky stairs going to it.
Oh, I'll never forget his look. You know, it wasn't a smiley look. He, like the Kennedy family men usually smile. He's very pale. I mean, he looked like he wasn't there.
I remember talking to some of the people that were at the event that were up on the truck. They were nervous. I mean, they were a lot more nervous, I think, than the senator was. They thought he felt bad about what had happened and felt bad for what he had to tell the group.
I guess he wasn't worried because that's the type of person he was. He seen something different that's in blacks that other white didn't see. So he trusted, I guess, because he understands and knows better than other whites.
I don't recall seeing, as I look into my memory now, police presence at all.
By the time Kennedy arrived, there was policemen with rifles on rooftops around the area. The police worried about the whole city exploding.
People were talking about they were gonna burn it out and kill the hunky, and they killed Martin. And this little guy, little bitty small white man, started talking, and you realize and you could see it was Robert Kennedy. And I thought, oh my God, they're gonna kill him.
Go right ahead.
Did they know about Martin Luther King?
To a certain extent. We have wrapped it up beyond the lesson that can be handled in this.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm only going to talk to you just for a minute or so this evening because I have some very sad news for all of you. Could you lower those signs, please?
The ones who are closest to him are more likely not to have heard the news. And so they are screaming and applauding, and they are also the people who are most likely to be Kennedy supporters because they've arrived early to get good places around the truck. And so they're waving his campaign signs with his pictures on, and they are wearing his buttons. And he can't deliver this kind of news if people are screaming and waving his signs in the air.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
We didn't even know that Dr. King had been killed until Robert Kennedy spoke.
I think most of the audience knew about it, but somehow here was a leader confirming that, yes, it is true. He has died.
It's as if the knowledge of it moved physically back through the crowd, which it did.
And it got real quiet. You could hear him. You could hear him. It got really quiet.
Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand, compassion, and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling.
I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man.
That it was the first time in my memory, or that I had ever heard of, in which he mentions Jack, the president, who had been assassinated.
He described him not even as my brother, he described him as a member of my family.
And here he's talking about it suddenly for the first time in public, you know, to several thousand people.
This was the last great national figure to have been killed was his brother. And it started him thinking about that, and he'd been wrestling with trying to make his peace with his brother's death for the past 5 years, and this is one more chance to do it.
There wasn't a person in America who didn't know that Robert Kennedy was running, in a sense, in place of his brother who had been assassinated.
He lost his brother, they lost their leader. He was able to put himself in their position and convince them that he understood.
On that night, he was wearing Jack's old tweed overcoat. And of course, imagine being cloaked in his brother's old coat as he gave this speech.
But what he's saying is, let's not think of this in racial terms. Let's think of this as something terrible that happened for all humanity, and it doesn't matter who did it. It's a loss that we've all suffered. And I had a loss also, and that comes to my mind now at this awful time.
I mean, it's as if he had saved this trump card, you know, since 1963 to play this in public, you know. And he could have played it for great political advantage. He could have played the assassination, but he never did. He saved that trump, and then he played it when it was needed the most.
But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus, and he once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God."
The words themselves just sort of drip, drop, and you could just sort of see it happening, and it just sort of calms you, also makes you very cold.
I don't think any campaign professional would have urged him to quote the Greeks at that point. Maybe Lincoln.
Modern politicians don't go around quoting Aeschylus to poor black audiences in Indianapolis, but maybe they should.
He did not talk to the poor any differently than he talked to the wealthy.
When John F. Kennedy was killed, Bobby had a terrible pang, not just that his brother was dead, but that he had somehow caused his brother's death. Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, had really gone after the mafia. He had been part of this whole plot to kill Castro, and he was worried that it was payback time, that the mob or some Cubans had come back, not to kill him, but to kill his brother. So he was racked with guilt, and he had to find a way to deal with this. And Bobby had always been good, faithful Catholic, the most Catholic member of his family, regular attendant at Mass, and certainly his wife was strongly Catholic, and yet he had a crisis of faith. On the night his brother died, when a friend put him to bed in the Lincoln bedroom, the fellow closed the door and heard Bobby cry out, "Why God?" And in the weeks that followed, Bobby temporarily lost his faith, and he began to search. And he looked in different places, and he found the Greeks, this whole idea that hubris, that overweening pride, that arrogance is paid back by the gods in tragedy and death and destruction. That resonated powerfully for him, this whole idea that the Kennedys, like the House of Agamemnon, had overreached, and that now they were reaping the reward.
You'd have to have a stone for a heart upon listening to that night in that place, not to appreciate what it was.
And they got the message, which is that through suffering comes wisdom, that it doesn't all have to be bleak and negative and bad, that when you feel the worst sometimes is when you learn the most.
Good poetry, good art, in any context, tends to elevate. He was a simple sounding man with some rich resources on which to draw. And he gets into that audience and, he plucks a flower out of Greek literature and hands it to an audience. And it had a wonderfully calming effect.
So what that showed, and what he proved by doing it, was that there is almost no person, no matter how mean their circumstances, no matter how scanted their education, who cannot be addressed in the noblest terms of which the human heart is capable.
What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. So I ask you tonight to return home, to say a prayer for the family Martin Luther King, yeah, it's true, but more importantly to say a prayer for our own country, which all of us love, a prayer for understanding and that compassion that of which I spoke. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And what dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
The crowd noise that you hear on two occasions was from a rather small portion of the crowd. I mean, it was a big crowd. It must have been several thousand. It sounded like several hundred, because most of them were silent, I think.
When he first announced it, there were people who put their fist up in the air and chanted Black Power at the rear of the crowd. There were people who were armed in that crowd. There were, I think that the fears were justified by the police that there could have been violence.
I felt a lot of anger, and certainly the natural tendency is to have someone feel your kick, to have someone feel your anger.
There were those who tried to incite riots. Some of the radical leaders, if you will. But it didn't work. Everybody went home.
And they made it very clear to us that they went to the site of the Kennedy speech with the clear intention of doing damage, doing injury to whomever.
I was mad like the rest of the folk there, but I was also very much aware that pure madness was not going to carry the day. It was not going to solve the problems and issues.
He basically said, this is your choice. How are you going to respond? How are we going to live with this? I know the pain of loss and suffering. That's honesty, that's candor, and that is born out of pain and the personal experience, and I think the people who were there on the street saw it, felt it, knew it.
And you would have to have been a part of the crowd when people were hugging each other, when they were coming up to persons they didn't even know and putting their heads on their shoulders and crying.
Dad takes it this way. Bobby Kennedy, him and Bobby Kennedy there settled that city. He felt that city was gonna blow. Certain cities I know of and connections I had, they were fired up, you know. Detroit was popping, Chicago was popping, violence was emerging, not Indianapolis.
Martin Luther King Jr. would have been very disappointed in all of the violence that occurred after and because of his death around the nation. But he would have been very proud of the order and the sense of peace and tranquility that existed in Indianapolis.
It was a hallelujah time, even in the midst of the storm.
Press wanted to be sure he had no notes. That was the news story, that he gave a speech to a black audience after Martin Luther King had been killed. And he wasn't reading from a text. He hadn't gone over it. Nobody had helped him prepare it.
No speechwriter was necessary. No focus group. No set of meetings. No calculation whatsoever.
He was with us. And he come to us. So that changed a lot of attitudes. And he did not sugarcoat anything. He said it the way it should be said.
He told the truth. He did not shy away from it. He said quite openly he could understand that black people might be filled with feelings of hatred and a desire for revenge against white people. And he also said, I can understand that because I had a member of my family killed. He didn't say it's wrong or evil to feel that. He said, I can understand that.
Folks have asked me to explain how this happened, and there is no way I could explain. I mean, he left all, he forsook all of the canons of rhetoric and stood there on that platform and invented his own. And it worked. It worked.
What kind of a soul does this man have that would allow him to give that speech?
Every day he would get up, I think as though it was going to be his last day on earth. And he would measure himself by what he had done that day. There was no procrastinating. Everything had to be done now because life is short and time is precious.
And the only answer I had to myself was, this is the man. This is why you're working for him. This is why you believe him.
Indianapolis was lucky he was there that night, I'll tell you. And then you think ahead, only a few weeks.
There was the Tet Offensive, there was Lyndon Johnson pulling out of the race, there was the King assassination. In the course of the California primary, the attitude certainly was, what's next? His message was working again, and so he did win in California.
That night, before Robert went down to make the speech, there was a call that came in to where we were operating out of from the hotel suite in Los Angeles. Senator Kennedy gets on the phone, and he was asking for some questions about the phone banks in New York. And he said some comment about, don't get New York messed up before I get there. And he said, we'll be back there Thursday.
Whether it's between blacks and whites, between the poor and the more affluent, or between age groups, or in the war in Vietnam, that we can start to work together. We are a great country.
I was standing on the platform behind Robert Kennedy as he spoke.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you.
When he finished his remarks, we had been told that there would be a press conference, and we had to get to the room by going through the kitchen.
Senator, this way.
So I turned quickly and headed there, and was just maybe 7 or 8 feet ahead of Robert Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy.
This worker, Saran, steps out in front of him with a cheap handgun and shoots him in the head.
Within 6 weeks, there are two bright lights in this society. Within a few weeks, both of them snuffed out. Look back on that 40 years ago and wonder what it might have been, if they both had survived.
Dr. King used to say, you have to be maladjusted to the problems, to the issues that you see around us. Robert Kennedy was maladjusted. Martin Luther King Jr. was maladjusted.
Both King and Kennedy, if they were alive today, would be saying the way to bring peace in the world is to reach out to those who had different faiths and different backgrounds and different ethics than our own. If they were alive today, the rhetoric of politics would be different. The rhetoric of religion would be different.
They had the ability to get in the way. Today we're too quiet, we're too silent. We need to find a way to push and pull and make a little noise and to stir the sense of false peace and the sense of false order that we have in our society today.
I'm sorry for the tears. It just was a horrible, horrible moment in my life. I may not have remembered everything he said, but I do remember his courage to stand up there because that's what it was, and that's how it was.
I was there, standing nearby, when Robert Kennedy spoke those words. They were powerful then, they're still powerful today. No one but no one have been able to capture the essence of what was happening in America then, not since. And what he said was very much in keeping with the very philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence as preached and taught by Martin Luther King Jr. And no one, but no one in America today is speaking the way Robert Kennedy spoke there.
It is not the leaders who create the change. It's individuals, ordinary people who went home that night peacefully and rededicated. It's important to stand back from it once in a while and remember what he said that night, and remember too to look at that stone wall and see that it moved. Didn't move because of Martin Luther King or Robert Kennedy or so many martyrs to the cause of justice. It moved because enough people thought to act in a just way because of them.
Just the next day, we were going to Grand Rapids, Michigan for an NAACP regional meeting. And as we stopped in roadside parks all the way from here, Grand Rapids, Michigan, there were whites that came up to us and told us how sorry they were that that happened and all, and that helped enormously to ease that pain.
Every year on November 20th, which was his birthday, I go up there early in the morning. The last 10 or 12 years, I've been pretty much alone, except for one guy whom I see there every year at about 7:30 in the morning. He waits for me sometimes, and I wait for him because I know we both come around at the same time. He works for the Senate. And we meet there and we have similar thoughts about Robert Kennedy, and we talk about him. You turn around and there's a small pool with a low wall on which are some excerpts from the speech in Indianapolis. Probably the only words in the whole cemetery that were extemporaneously spoken. And then on another section of the same wall are the words from speech in South Africa.
Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance.
Open the floor and find out if there's anything about it that anybody here wants to know that's left after all of that.
Thank you for joining us, first of all. But one of the things that resonated with me was when one of the comments was he used the trump card. He saved the trump card until the very end. How did that statement resonate with you? Did you feel like it was a trump card that was used? Like, I felt that was almost derogatory to a certain extent.
No, it wasn't derogatory. It's just that at times like that and involving events like that, we all struggle to find something, to find a way to think about it, and to have something to say about it. particularly if you're a reasonably half-famous journalist, you want to have something to say. Okay, so there it is. What was important, however, the people who said that he was doing his best to open himself to the experience. I think about that. What are most people, what are most Pauls or most people in public life doing? They're performing. They're trying to create a favorable picture of themselves and to present it. Because people in politics basically, not to be too snide about it, because I've been in politics also, so this is, I'm saying this about myself as well as about others. But the fact is, think about lawyers. What are lawyers? Lawyers are people who at the age of 2, somebody patted them on the head for speaking a complete sentence. And they spend the whole rest of their lives trying to recapture that feeling. Politicians are sort of a more intense version of the same thing. So you're not allowed not to have something to say. And the overwhelming majority of the time, it is a performance. That's why so few politicians ever actually reach other human beings, because everybody can tell it's an act. Everybody knows it. And when we've had political figures who got beyond that, whether the two that the film talks about, or you go back in our often spectacular history, and you see, you think about what's really going on with the Washingtons and the Jeffersons and the Lincolns and people like that. When you're doing that, you know the difference. People know the difference. So, and it happens because these men and women are willing to open themselves. And we all know that, don't we? We all know that in our own lives, that if you want to really speak to somebody, you have to first be willing to open and find out what that person is trying to say to you. And that's just in our personal lives, in our most immediate lives, with our own parents, our own children, our own wives and husbands and friends. That's what it is. So when you think about what Robert Kennedy was doing that night, what he's doing that allows him to reach back to the way he felt, that's what that is. That's an act of friendship. That's an act that says, and it's a way of speaking that says, we have to be friends. I'm your friend. You may not feel it that way about me right now, but I'm telling you that I feel. It's interesting because one of the first places that he went as a senator, one of the first places that he went to give a speech after he was elected, we went down to the University of Mississippi. Now, people, there's no reason why you should know this. This isn't a quiz. But as Attorney General, he was bitterly hated in the entire southern part of the United States. And one of the reasons that he was hated so much, and certainly why he was hated in the state of Mississippi, was because in order to desegregate the University of Mississippi, it was necessary to get actually physically onto that campus and into the classroom a man named James Meredith, who was the plaintiff in a lawsuit to desegregate the University of Mississippi. a state institution which nonetheless was officially racially discriminatory. Well, to do that, because there was some really major violent resistance, it took the federal marshals, it took police, and since there wasn't a lot of help from a lot of local police, it took federal troops in the state of Mississippi for the first time since Reconstruction. It took federal troops to get that done and to get James Meredith there. One of my law school classmates who was also working at the Department of Justice at the time got to say, and he built a political career in New York out of saying that I was James Meredith's roommate, which he was. They slept in the same room for a while because somebody had to do that. So here's all this terrific resentment and hate. And in 1965, which is the first year he's a United States Senator, he gets an invitation to address the student body at the University of Mississippi. So off we went. I had no idea what the reception was going to be. As it turned out, it was one of the warmest receptions he ever had. From a crowd that was overwhelmingly white, and where the assumption was these people would hate him and would throw things, et cetera, et cetera. But it was very interesting because when you're doing speeches and you're doing rhetoric, one of the often very effective things to do is to reach back into the past so that you're giving a sense of some historical continuity. And you reach for a sentiment that expresses what you're trying to say. So as it turned out, back before the Civil War, Jefferson Davis had come to give a speech in New York. In Boston, in Faneuil Hall. He had come there and he had addressed the audience as brothers, friends, countrymen. That's before the Civil War. And so when Robert Kennedy went to Mississippi, which was, after all, Jeff Davis's birthplace, and the state from which he was a senator, he harked back to that. And he said that, rivers of blood and years of darkness separate that day from this. But they still echo down to this day. Bringing the message that only as brothers and friends can we master and bring to our service the vast forces that rage across the world we live in. Now, again, there's a lot of years in between that day and this one. But I would ask you whether, if people had approached the last year in the state of Missouri and in these counties in that same way, if they had been thinking about those words that Jeff Davis spoke when he was more sane than the lunatic he later became or acted as, or the words that meant so much to Robert Kennedy and Martin King, would you all be in the same place as everybody is now? Did that answer the question?
Yes.
One of Robert Kennedy's great charms, and there were many. Most people are familiar with the fact that that when there's a question and answer forum, that very often what happens is somebody gets up and asks a question that takes about 5 minutes to get out. And everybody in the audience is fidgeting and wondering how much longer is this going to go on, and believe me, the one who's really wondering how much longer it's going to go on is the speaker. So after, what he used to do is after a particularly long and complex question, he would say, he would just sort of pause and he would say, yes. Or if he was in a different mood, he would say, no. Anyway, is there what's the next question, if there is one? Yes, sir.
Did Senator Kennedy and Martin Luther King, I knew they knew each other, but how well?
They weren't, neither one of them, they weren't drinking buddies, and they weren't the kind of people who sat around and had purposeless or sort of random conversation. Martin Luther King was unbelievably engaged. He was on it all the time. And so indeed was Robert Kennedy. These were two giants of the country, and they were all working at it all the time. They weren't, you didn't see, I mean, I don't want to say anything invidious about anybody, but the fact is I'm not aware that either Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King ever played a round of golf. They weren't golfers. And however, if you're asking, did they, in a sense, they were having a conversation about the country all the time. Because I guarantee you that each of them knew what the other was doing and saying. And after all, look, during the time that Robert Kennedy, the whole time he was a United States Senator, let's just talk about that, and because that's a period when I can testify to, because I was there every day, and so I knew what was going on, what we were doing. So throughout that time, the master problem of the United States, of the country, we obviously had a horrid war to, you know, that we had to get out from under and deal with, and there are other foreign problems. And indeed, the problem that he chose as his subject of his maiden speech, the first big speech in the Senate, and spent enormous time and effort on, was the problem of nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation, which were then and still are a threat to everybody in this room and everybody you know and everyone you love and the entire United States of America. A fact, by the way, which seems to be escaping the intelligent attention of our national government. And what we have instead is a bunch of people, senators of both parties, I hasten to say, who are talking about conflict and war in Eastern Europe with a spirit so cavalier, so thoughtless that it can truly be described as idiotic and hateful. People who seem to have no consciousness of the seriousness of the things with which they're dealing. So there was always that. There was always that. But I don't think there was a day, when this profound dilemma that we have been dealing with since the first foot set on this country's soil. There wasn't a day that wasn't alive for attention and thought and an effort to do something better. They're all the time. I know, spent more time of all that time working for him. I spent more time on that than anything else by far. You had to. And it was obviously at the heart of Martin Luther King's whole existence. But he also, on the other side of that and balancing it, he also came to see the effort to end our war, that war, which was then our longest war, not nearly so now. But he came to see that as of equal importance as, so that there was actually a constant dialogue going on. And every so often there would be a letter, or there would be a message, or a mutual friend would talk. John Lewis is a very good example, although he was younger then. But he was a very, very close aide to Dr. King. And he was a terrific political force working for us in that election. Profound force. And Peter Edelman's then friend, later wife, Marion Wright, she was also a very close aide of Dr. King's. So there was always that kind of back and forth, as indeed there had to be. I don't know, were there any friendships like that working in, or associations like that working in Ferguson? You're shaking your head. You're shaking your head, sir.
Yeah, I doubt it.
No, it was not apparent from outside that there were associations like that there were fellowship, that there was friendship that could overcome. And nothing solves all the problems. There are no magic wands. Just because you sat down and had dinner with somebody once or twice or 10 times doesn't mean that all the problems go away, right? We all know that. I actually know people who've been married for many, many years, and they still argue once in a while. You know anybody like that? But the fact is that if you don't have that, if that doesn't exist, if there isn't a desire, if there isn't a will that says, hey, wait a minute, come on, it just can't, we've got to be able to sit and talk about this. If there isn't that, then we're lost. Mm-hmm. Because there's no such thing as you can't treat your fellow citizens as if they're citizens from some far-off hostile country. It just can't be done and keep things going. Can't work that way. It never has. If you look back to the periods of our country's history in which the greatest things were done and the most was achieved, well, one of the things you're talking about, for example, the revolutionary period, and what you're talking about is a relatively small number of human beings. Thank God it was smaller then, because we never would have been able to do it otherwise. But they knew each other. They thought about each other. Has anybody here, for example, ever read any of the correspondence between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, which went on for years after they had retired from public life, after each of them had completed his presidency, and they'd been great political rivals for many, many years. You know, the parties essentially, well, not really, but the Federalist Party, of which John Adams was the head, was bitterly opposed by Jefferson's Republicans. Really nasty, but they knew each other. They had been there when the Constitution was done. They had been there together through the Revolution. And those people, those men who pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, and many of them had to make good on that pledge. But they were people who, they knew each other. They had that feeling of a common effort. They were friends and country. And that went together. I mean, it's one of the great stories of American history, though they corresponded for years thereafter, Adams and Jefferson. They made up their quarrels. And then they died on the same day, which was the 4th of July. The stunning, things that life and history do to us is give us things like that to ponder on. Yes.
Was it palpable at the time when you were in the midst of greatness? Could you tell that you were in the midst of greatness during that time? And do you long for that voice, that message that Bobby Kennedy and Dr. King had today? But I might say that I feel like I'm in the midst of greatness here in Utah today.
Well, you're very nice. To the extent that anything like that is in the room, I think it's the reflection of what was. I will say this, however. Some of you know that among other things, supported by the immense friendship and love and efforts of Mark Byington, that I spent certainly the last 25, 30 years of my life, I gave up my law practice and I devoted it to trying to change the police system in the country, change police, the way they work, the way they're trained, the way they approach these problems, and and what contribution they make to the communities in which they work. And when I first made the announcement of my plans, my very ambitious plans to do this, I had a press conference and a bunch of people came, and there was a really nice guy named Gabe Pressman, who was a typical New York reporter for TV. And I had said something about the principles of the revolution, the principles of the founders. And he said, Are you saying that you're gonna stand in the shoes of the founders? And I said, Gabe, none of us can fill their shoes, but we can all follow in their footsteps. And that is, I think, that's the real lesson. In all the years that I worked for Robert Kennedy, I never once heard him say, if only President Kennedy were alive, we could fix this. He never said it. You know why? Because I never asked him why he never said it, but I believe the reason he didn't is because I know that for him, that would have been a statement of weakness.
if we say, well, we could do something if only that guy were alive, what are we saying? We're saying we're helpless now because he's dead and he's not coming back. So if we make such a statement, it's saying we're helpless. We don't have, and if you're helpless, then you say, well, I don't have to do anything. There wouldn't be any point to it. That's why he never said it. And the truth is, think about it. Think about it. If you're going to say, for example, if you're going to say, well, what are we going to do because Robert Kennedy's not alive? That's true. But if what we want to do is bring back the dead, well, why stop there? How about saying, wouldn't it be great if President Lincoln walked in the door? How about George Washington? We could say, wouldn't it be wonderful if Christ walked the earth again? Or Buddha or anyone else. It's hopeless. There's no point to that. The only thing that works is we have to look at the gifts that people brought to us, not what they aren't bringing anymore, but what they brought to us once. There isn't a lesson that Jesus ever taught that isn't available to everybody in this room today. There wasn't any principle of leadership or statesmanship or devotion to America that isn't available in a good biography of George Washington today. There are no such lessons. They're all there. They're all there. When we were doing, when Mark and I and a bunch of other people in the country were doing this training of young police officers who we were hoping to equip for a lifetime of service and devotion. So every chance we would get, I would spend government money, and some of my own, to get them to Washington, D.C., and take them out to Arlington, to the cemetery there. Because it's impossible to stand there on those beautiful green lawns and see row upon row upon row of gravestones of men and some women who willingly dedicated their lives to the country, to their fellow citizens, to us, to me, to my children, to my grandchildren. It's happening every day. Now, my own view is that, in fact, the disasters of our current wars, and they are, in my view, utter disasters, they are more tragic because of the wastage of so many young lives and bodies. But at the same time, it is not possible to think of those young men and women out there on the lines at getting up every morning to take another guy named Bing West, who's a good reporter. He was a grunt in Vietnam, and he went out and lived with, embedded with Marines in a Marine unit in the worst part of Afghanistan. And he wrote a book, A Million Steps, he called it. because he calculated that in the 8 months of an infantry tour, these Marines with whom he was embedded would walk 1,000,000 steps. They would take 1,000,000 steps, and every one of those steps was a step on which it was possible that if they hit the pressure plate, they would be going up in the air and they would come down without legs or without other parts of their body, or would simply come down dismembered in shards. But they kept on doing it. They kept on getting up in the morning and doing what they saw as their responsibility to all of us. And yet when they come back, often grievously injured, you don't see them coming up and grabbing people on the street and saying, "You stiff, I did this for you, and what are you doing?" They could say it, they'd have a right to say it, but they don't. So what that then was all about, and what those relationships were about and are about, it's nothing but recognition. Is there anything worse than an ingrate? I remember we had a mayor of New York, Robert Wagner, very wry figure, and he once said, this will be familiar to you, he once said he hated making a judge. He hated having to appoint a judge, because every time he made a judge, he made 9 enemies and 1 ingrate. There speaks the man, there laughs the man who knows. So there isn't much that's worse than that, and so, you know, back in the day, those days, the days of, among other things, the days of romance, there were singers in those days who actually sang a lot about what was going on in the country and in the world. That sometimes it got pretty savage, but there was one of whom he was a friend, and he was a particularly wonderful person. One of a number who, in those days, there were a lot of suicides of feeling people, and he was one of them. But while he was alive, he sang a bunch of songs about war and life and death. And recently I was trying to tell somebody about him, and the modern world actually gave me a start. I don't even carry a smartphone, but I found out that YouTube is really something terrific. First off, by the way, I don't know whether it's of interest to you, but I would be remiss if I did not take this opportunity to tell you that one of the great, I mean really spectacular operatic performances of all time is available for free on YouTube. Put in Cozy fan tutte 2006 at Glyndebourne. And I guarantee you, you are in for 3 hours of the most spectacular musical education that you will ever have. And Cozy fan tutte means, actually, ladies, watch out, it means they all do it. But the other thing that's on YouTube is that a man named Phil Oakes, who was a friend of mine and many others, who was a great, wonderful singer, folk singer, he had a performance of a song that he did, wrote and performed called The Crucifixion. It was about the life and death of President Kennedy. And anyway, so I urge you also, you can look at that. You will not fail to be affected when you do. But so I had that, I got some CDs of his. I was inspired, I went back, I got some CDs of his old songs and some of the anti-war stuff. And it was interesting because I have it in rotation on my car stereo. So I was in the car with my 15-year-old grandson. And I asked him, I put it on, and I asked him, do you, your friends, ever listen to anything that's even remotely like this? No. We don't have anything like this. And I said, okay. I said, I get that, but let me ask you, I mean, just listen to what he's singing. Just listen to what he's saying. Listen to what he's telling you about what's going on. I said, do any of you really think about stuff like this? No. No, we don't. I said, well, that's interesting, I said to him. Boy, am I getting in deep with this. I said, it's interesting because after all, the guys who are out there now, getting blown up, they're only 2 or 3 years older than you and your friends. These are your, you know, these are people of your generation. They're people, they're your fellow citizens. They're kids who are just, they look just like you. And it doesn't mean anything? No. No. So, first thing it tells me is that you can have a deficiency of education. I can see a deficiency of education in my own family, but I think there's too much of, I think there's an excess of that kind of general approach to life all around us. And I see enough people nodding to say that that probably is true. Okay. We have to decide, one of the things we have to decide is what is our future? Do we have one? There are many people among us, there are many of our own people who have to be thought of right now as doomed. Doomed! You look at the kids, for example, growing up in some parts of Chicago, and they are so profoundly affected, they are so profoundly alienated from anything constituting civilized life that day after day after day they're killing people who look just exactly like them. They are the same people, they're their neighbors. They're kids in their own school. They're kids they bump into on the street. So people living this way, we have to say, if we're acknowledging truth, we have to say, yes, these people are doomed if they act like this. So then our question is, do we have a responsibility? The lesson that my old friend taught, it's still there. We even have it on film. We don't even have to go to a book to find it. It's really easy. Those lessons, they are there for us. So I guess that's what you're here to learn in the last analysis, because that's what will decide who we are, how we live, how we die, what we're willing to live for, and what we're willing to die for. Thank you.
To keep the motivation up, we've also provided some additional snacks, fruit, and all the water that you need out there, but we'd like to go into what we call the small group discussions. And we're going to take the ideals that are floating around in your mind right now and put it into thought as a group work.
Well, I'm Scott Holzer, and we're going to finish up by talking about what we did in the breakout sessions. And if there's anything that anybody wants to ask or start with right now before we go through the groups, feel free. Any dynamic? Oh, well, then I guess we're going to proceed with the breakout leaders. Who's
Cindy's, I think.
Cindy's?
I think is that yours?
Yes, Frosty's rooms, yep.
Do you want to summarize?
And your group?
Summarize all that.
Well, no, just any new.
We had good discussion. I think we all were questioning what we can do individually. I think that, let's see. I think the important thing was saying something and not being complacent, that we can start with ourselves. Whenever we're in a situation that we feel there is any type of injustice or stereotype, if you will, if we can be neutral or in any way say something to make everybody think about it. Someone have a voice, don't be worried about what people are thinking of us. Be knowledgeable about situations. So, I don't want to read all that. You don't want me to read all that.
You have an app to get out of technology?
Do I have an app to get out of technology? It's funny you say that. My 20-year-old sons are actually getting rid of all their apps because they see the addiction to their technology and not just using their phone for talking, and to get rid of that for themselves, they've just taken all their apps off their phone.
Wow.
So I don't know if that's answering any of that, but the distractions, and not being open to and looking at what's around them and being present in the moment. But, we had some good feedback.
So most of your proactive things are at the bottom here? Well, no.
No, there isn't anything on that list that can be viewed as proactive in a major way, from what I can see. So all of that stuff is important. I would only add one thing to it that you could think about. And I think we have this particular language on a piece of paper that you can distribute. This is about Simone Weil, who was a French philosopher. And after the war came in September 1939, World War II, she wrote on a fragment of paper, "We need, first of all, to have a clear conscience. Let us not think that because we are less brutal, less violent, less inhuman than our opponents, that we will carry the day. Brutality, violence, and inhumanity have an immense prestige that school books hide from children, that grown men do not admit, but that everyone bows before. For the opposite virtues, to have as much prestige, they must be actively and constantly put into practice. Anyone who is merely incapable of being as brutal, as violent, and as inhuman as someone else, but who does not practice the opposite virtues, is inferior to that person in both inner strength and prestige, and he will not hold out in such a confrontation. So what that says, and she's a really brilliant woman, what that's saying, it seems to me, is all of these things that you're putting up, they're really important, but the test is with what firmness, what dedication, what strength, and what plainness of speech and forcefulness of action we use to practice, to put these things into practice.
If you scroll to the top, you can see who's that is. It's yours.
Yeah. Okay, so we talked a lot about Ferguson. We talked about not perpetuating a cycle of violence, and we talked about taking that moment before you act and think about what the consequences of your actions are, and beyond just not reacting violently yourself, also make sure that you are doing things to keep kind of inherent violence that exists in a system or a government or whatever from reoccurring. So that could, extend to your civic responsibilities beyond just, someone punching back. It's a very complex set of things. Let's see what else. And we talked about how peaceful does not mean passive, and so that's sort of what MLK was doing. It was peaceful resistance, but it was still active. It was still engaged. And then we talked about various ways that a person might kind of deal with their own emotional response, kind of try to calm their own nerves, try to be peaceful in sort of a deep level so that they're not compelled to react with violence. I don't know if anyone from my group had anything else they wanted to add to that, please do. Anybody?
I would only say that what we've discussed in our training with Adam and I, with a lot of police leaders throughout the country, with young people as well, is the understanding that it takes more courage and more strength to act, and to act in nonviolence, than to act in violence. It doesn't take much strength and courage and character to do so. It's actually less. And to act even with the presence of fear, to do so with actual violence. And violence, what I mean, is excessive. So it's to act. So I think it sounds to me like you're really right on there for that thought.
That was what I had said in there right off the bat. Don't be afraid to stand up if you see something going on. Just the idea of you even saying, hey, I see that we're doing that, that's not right, might be enough to make it stop. And people are afraid to do that.
Could I ask a question? What is the effect of putting at the top of the list, have federal intervention more readily available? What is hoped to be accomplished by that?
And what is meant?
I think, I can't remember exactly who brought it up, but I think they were talking about the National Guard in Ferguson. And they were saying that they wanted,
You mean at the time of the...
Right. So they were saying from the outside, not necessarily knowing what people in Ferguson were experiencing, just maybe seeing it on TV. That seemed like some sort of reasonable response, wherein people on the ground may realize that it's a more nuanced situation, and you can't just call in the National Guard if it's not called.
It's not a weighted list, it's chronological.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true.
It's not weighted, it's just...
Yes.
It's
well,
just what came up.
whichever you call it, weighted or chronological. Is there an effect? I mean, I'm doing something, I'm getting the federal government in here. Is that a statement that actually parses?
The statement that they actually made is that if they would have brought the National Guard into Ferguson faster, they might have saved buildings and other things being destroyed. It
Let me ask a clarification. We're talking about, in a sense, that single incident that evening in which they were present, but they were outside the area. That's what, it's just about, they were already there, they were already present, and the view is a lot of the destruction that occurred in Ferguson wouldn't have been if they wouldn't have been on the outer area, but in the inner part. Is that correct? We are talking about just kind of a specific incident.
No, kind of opposite. I'm thinking bringing in more guards and more military and militarizing it more actually agitates the situation.
I think that's where Mr. Walensky's getting at it, that it's not going to resolve what we're talking about in the major scale. It actually elevates that energy level to be more physical.
And we're also talking about, this whole thing is supposed to be about personal responsibility. And when you say, I don't want to deal with that, send in the National Guard.
Isn't that certainly a possible interpretation of that? That would be, I think that's always the temptation. I mean, if we think about it, isn't that right? What do we hear time and time again, even from public officials? Well, we can't do anything about that. Write your senator.
Yes.
I'll turn that over to the federal government.
That's what we heard from the mayor of Ferguson.
Yeah, it is. And you hear that kind of thing all the time, don't you?
Yeah.
And so what it really ends up as, all too often, is a huge crutch and an excuse and a way of not of accepting responsibility, but of dodging it. Isn't that right? And we see that that's the bureaucratic, tick every time. Oop! State, go state. Federal, give it to the feds. Do the feds ever actually solve any of these things?
No. Because of time. The picture I'd like for people to remember that the most powerful group who took action regarding nonviolence was the members of the people who lived in Ferguson. If you can remember that picture, they walked out and they went arm in arm, every other person facing the police on one side and the protests on the other, and they stood between them all. Those were all people who lived in the community, who stepped out. They did more to keep the peace than all the armed military that was in the surrounding area. It was individuals who, not planned, stepped out and started linking arms to make sure nobody started fighting. So that was a more powerful action than any military coming in, was the people and the individuals. It wasn't even an organized deal. They just started linking arms. So I'm usually doing Scott.
Oh, yeah.
Nope.
As you can see, our list is a little bit shorter. We kind of got caught up in, I don't want to say caught up, but we had a very good discussion on more of the, what causes some of this violence, what are the grand issues in regards to this, and we never actually got to what individually we could do right now or in the near future. We talked a lot about social economic status. We talked about access to resources and jobs, et cetera, and what that does to the psyche of not only an individual, but of a complete community. And I will stop talking there and let the people in my group finish that. Because that's what I heard in the conversation.
Anybody want to expand on that second one?
Did you want to say anything? No. Mr. Underwood. Did you want to add anything?
Well, I was waiting to get down a question.
Okay. Will you scroll up, please?
Yes. I was looking at the second question, I guess, or statement that was made, and looking at history. And one of the perceptions that I was considering was like our prison system. And, when you look around and people ask the question, well, why are all the black folks in the prisons? And it kind of leaves the perception that they're the only ones doing crime. Well, that's not true. Is the system balanced? I can understand when we're talking about being balanced. When we have to go through the system, more than, I won't say a particular percentage, but a high percentage of the time, people of color end up in prison. And it's not that they, I'm just saying question about who did the crime, they say justice is blind. But it looks like that's a perception that we are doing all the crime because that's all that's in the majorities in the prisons. And that sets up a thing for violence in itself because people, when you get stopped by the police and all, you don't feel like there's a justice system there for you, which causes some violent situations.
Anybody else?
Would you add media to that too? Our local
Media.
news does not
Yes.
cover the news equally.
Equally.
Yeah, we talked about legal access in that group as well. Access to legal representation is part of that
The
problem.
perception that's being planted, young and old, in people's minds is what is printed in the media and what is shown in the media.
Well, there is
Influences.
statistics of if you take a black male and a white male, or a black female and a white female, whites are more likely to get probation, blacks are more likely to get a sentence.
I'm not in the media, but in defense of the media, it depends on who you watch too, because some of the programs I watch, they do address this.
They address it, but I mean, the lead stories would indicate that they give the perception of that.
No, I don't feel that way. No, what I watch, there will be lead stories on, some of these. I know what you're saying though, like the very breaking news, kind of like the first thing. But
Yeah,
I mean,
mainstream
local
media
news.
leads with that, and it's not an actual perception. It's a perception.
Can I ask a question? Because here now we're starting maybe to peel the onion, okay? So let's start with, I would like to start with this question. Who is more likely to be a victim of crime than anyone else? Who are the principal victims of criminal violence?
People of the lower social economic status.
What you're really saying is black people living in black neighborhoods
In this area, yes. We're in-
nationwide are more likely to be victims of criminal violence than anyone else.
This is where Adam and I will debate. Jefferson County would mean that there's no crime. I mean, we only have 4%
No, I
minorities.
said they're more likely. Overall, they're more likely to be victims of crime. And would you agree with me that the worst thing that we do in our decision-making about the use of police and other similar resources is to underserve black communities, is to leave more violence in their schools, is to leave more kids at risk of sexual violence and other similar things. And would we regard, look at, a place like Chicago or Baltimore where we did so much work, or other places like that, and you look at the kids who were dying on the street. Look at kids who are dying on the street. Is that my kid? My grandchildren are not dying on the street. The kids dying on the street look a lot more like you, don't they, sir?
Yes.
Yeah.
And is the problem that the police are paying too much attention to this problem? I don't think so. So when you are, I would think that you're completely entitled to protest the policies of the police, the courts, the system, and so on. But it's not because too much attention is being paid to black people. It's that they're left too often to fend for themselves. And if, for example, you're a young person, if you're a young boy, who's left to fend for himself in a violent community and on the streets, everybody's read the work of Professor Anderson, right? So you've read that and you know it's in the presence of that personal violence and exploitation that kids start saying, hey, nobody's going to take care of me. I'm going to have to take care of myself, me and my friends. That's all I have. That's all I know. So they're being consigned right now. Isn't that true? Being consigned to a life and a future in which, in many cases, they feel that violence is the only thing that's on offer to them. It's the only answer that they know.
Right.
And who's there teaching them something else? That would be the question. So the answer is the answer to say, well, the problem is there's too many people in prison. Well, there is certainly, one of the things that's interesting, by the way, a statistic that you can use to get into arguments about this. People often say, well, the reason that so many black people are in prison is because they do so many violent crimes. What very few people know is that if you look at black people, or for that matter, white people, but people who are in prison for crimes right now, only 28% of them are in for violent crimes. All the rest are in for non-violent crimes. Now, how does that happen?
The system. Our system's broken.
Indeed. Indeed it is, in many respects. In many, many respects. My only question, the suggestion I'm trying to make is...
Can I make a comment?
Please.
All over the world, our prison system, in the U.S., our prison system, we have more non-violent crimes than anywhere else. Everywhere else, people just get fines, or for drug addiction or something. But our country, we send them to prison instead of getting them the help they need. They need help, but instead of helping them, we punish them.
There isn't any doubt that the United States imprisons more of its population than any other country. It's true. And it is also true that the great majority of people, or a substantial majority of people who are in prison, are in non-violent crimes as opposed to violent crimes. Now, there's a little hook in that to which you have to pay attention, you have to acknowledge, which is a lot of the non-violent crimes, so-called, are drug crimes. And a lot of times, and I know this for a fact, a lot of very conscientious police departments will use drug crimes, which are easier to prove, as a way to incarcerate violent people who are indeed a threat to the community.
Yeah, that's true.
So you can't just automatically say, well, let all the non-violent criminals go, because they're going to show you that they're pretty violent in many cases pretty soon. So it's always necessary to know your facts and be in control of them, but what is not permissible, I hope we could agree, what is not permissible is to let our inclinations and our desire to be peaceful lead us to abandon the safety and security of all of these people, many of them kids, many of them mothers, who just have no defense. They're all there by themselves. And what do we do? Remember what Simone Weil said. Can we just be passive about our attitude toward these people? Or do we have to say we need to be actively engaged? We need to look at what do they really require. I can't tell you how many times, and it was more dispiriting every time. I would go, say, to the Henry Horner houses in Chicago, which were just the worst of the worst. And what was horrible about them was that the Chicago Housing Authority and the Chicago Police Department and everybody else, the whole Chicago government just ignored it. And so you literally had, the place was full of single mothers who could not protect or do anything for their children. They just couldn't, they were just helpless. And many of them were people, I mean, I can't tell you what, how much of a burden many of them took on themselves, you know, in spite of these circumstances, to try to raise their kids decently and give them some hope, but they were completely without help. So I would say that I'm all for looking at all of those conditions, absolutely, but looking at them with clear eyes and being determined to protect people who are now, you know, the government of the United States, we have public officials talking about the responsibility to protect R2P, which means you have to go into Libya and bomb a whole bunch of people because you're asserting they have human rights violations, so we're going to kill a few tens of thousands. I would be happier if we were talking more about our responsibility to protect more of our own citizens. Mm-hmm. Kids trying to grow up and actually get to school during the week unmolested. And, you know, parents trying to raise their kids in some kind of decent atmosphere without harassment and without, you know, without being bullied by the police, but also without being bullied and kicked around by their neighbors. Those were always, I thought, the tasks, the essential tasks of the police, which is instead to teach people how to live together without enforcing their will on their neighbors and fellow citizens. That's what we hope, right? So that's all. I just wanted to keep putting that out there. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interject, but if I could, you know, make a comment. Well, I think it goes without saying, or, you know, statistics aside, disregard for people of color is very prevalent. It doesn't matter whether it's in Jefferson County, where it is 4% minority, or whether it's in Ferguson, where it's predominantly black. I have had some involvement being in Ferguson, and I can tell you just by talking with some of the people there that how they felt violated was not just a woe is me, you know, I feel like the police are picking on me, but whether or not the federal government can solve this problem or not, the fact that they did do the digging and the prying into the situation and uncover the emails and things of that nature and what was going on in that particular police department, it validated how the people were in fact being treated. So, you know, people were not just whining and complaining. They had actual things happen to them.
There can't be a doubt of it. And my position has always been, and I think it would be in complete accord with yours. I think the thing, you know, there's an expression in the law, res ipsa loquitur, and what it means is the thing speaks for itself. And when you witness the breakdown of authority and the failure to enforce the most basic rights of citizenship, the failure to do that in community after community speaks for itself, I would say. The thing speaks for itself, and I think it's criminal. In the deepest moral sense, you cannot. I mean, what would happen? What would happen? For example, what would we say if a bunch of people from the Middle East invaded New York and took over most of the city and started killing people right and left. Well, you can imagine, the world would practically come to an end. The bombers would be flying, there would be thousands and thousands of troops, everybody would be ready to do something about it. But isn't that exactly what's been going on? Is that exactly what's been going on? It's just as if there were foreign armies coming to the streets of Oakland, California, and Detroit, Michigan, and Chicago, Illinois, and city after city, but only in certain parts of the cities. But we don't have a similar response. Isn't that an accurate statement?
Yeah, I would definitely, I agree 100%.
And that's what I would say, that's where we have to begin paying attention to what's right in front of our eyes.
That's right. But and again, I credit you, Mr. Lewinsky, and everybody in here that we are able to have this kind of dialogue and talk about this. And this is an ever-going problem. And I think it starts with everybody coming together with their collaborative thoughts and ideas and really just having an open discussion. I think this is awesome. And I commend everybody. I think this is great.
Yeah, I do too. I think that it's just what we were trying to talk about.
And I know
this is what friends are for.
Yeah.
This is what it's supposed to be about. This is what it means to be fellow citizens. Is to be willing to do this and to be willing to look at all the hard parts too. One of the things that people, as we know, that people really, it makes everybody feel bad. One of the things that makes everybody feel bad is the extent of sexual violence, particularly against very young women and girls, that takes place in many of these communities. It's a horror, and anybody who's done any work at it and who's actually talked to these kids and been through some of their stories, you cannot imagine. I sat with one young girl, this again was in Baltimore in the course of training we were doing, I sat, and she was trying to explain to some completely moronic, unfeeling, and not understanding police officer what was really wrong with her life. I point out to you, by the way, that he was also black, so it's not as if there's any racial specialty in sensitivity to the problems of young kids or young women. We all know that, right? But some guilty liberals never get over it. I think it's because they then think that since they're white, they have an excuse to not do anything since they wouldn't listen to me anyway. They don't really want me there. So, but anyway, so I'm listening to this kid and she's explaining what happened to her. And listen to this. She was beaten and raped by her mother's boyfriend. That's just part of the territory. So then she told her mother, you know what her mother did? Her mother went to the front door of the house. She opened the door, she went out, and the kid never saw her again. So the thing is, we can't hear something like that. We can't know that there's a young woman who's experienced that and then just turn and walk away from it and count it as a statistic or an item for a report on the welfare sheet, right? And that, by the way, I would suggest that's the kind of thing, that's the one place, that kind of situation is the one place where we know that individual acts of kindness can have a tremendous effect. There are, in fact, all kinds of cases in which the acts of individual kindness have really saved kids' lives, have saved them from the pit, have made a huge difference. You know, again, there are statistics that so many people don't know. For example, everybody complains, for example, about the welfare system, right? Welfare system is terrible. We pay out all this money, and it's all going to these black people who won't take care of their kids. What most people don't know, including most welfare professionals don't know, is that the extended families in these neighborhoods care for 4 times as many children as the entire official welfare system.
Financially?
Physically caring for them in their houses, feeding them, getting them to school, you know, dealing with their problems and just talking to them. 4 times as many are just being cared for by private citizens, private people who may or may not be part of their extended family. That's what happens in these communities. So we know, therefore, that there are many, many children who are at least infinitely better off than they would be in the official system because of the kindness and the love of either distant relatives or strangers. It's happening every single day. And since we know that that happens, then we have to ask, why is it that there are many, many kids who are left without this? Who are just falling between the cracks because somebody is not looking at what they're doing, even for an afternoon. You know, when we were training police in Baltimore as to how to work with young kids, what we found was that if we put them together with these kids just for a couple of days, they ended up with tremendous friendships. And these cops were giving their kids their cell phone numbers. Can you imagine a cop giving some street kid his cell phone number? But it was happening. They were all doing it. And the kids thought these people were wonderful because the kids didn't care if you were white or black. Kids didn't care whether you were male or female. Kids didn't care whether you were old or young or how old or what. They didn't care about any of that. All they cared was somebody actually is talking to me. Somebody is saying something to me and asking me questions and listening to what I say, right? Isn't that your experience? Sir, when you see any of these kids, isn't that the way they are?
That's what they are. I agree with you.
So, that when people talk about active engagement, I don't know what that means, but I know what it means when somebody is taking time to spend time with a kid. Yes.
Oh, you mentioned about the Baltimore Police Department. A few years ago, I saw the man, I don't know what his exact title is, but he was over the safety for the Baltimore schools. And what I heard was a hearing with Congress or the rep or the senators, I forgot what. But it sounded like what he was doing there, I don't know if he's still in office, so to speak, it was a model for the rest of the country when it comes to schools. Are you familiar with him, or do you know anything about their program as far as school safety?
Actually, I don't want to be a complete killjoy, but the Baltimore school police, at least when I was there, were a terrible organization. Most of those school police, most people, not everyone, but most school police officers are people who, for one reason or another, are rejected by the police department. And, the kids get second best or 10th best. And there are a lot of, unfortunately, there were a lot of cases of exploitation of one kind or another, and a lot of times they just don't pay attention. So, it's always necessary to look at facts. Remember, I kept emphasizing that my old boss was never afraid of the facts, never afraid of the truth. And that's the way I would suggest that's the way we have to be. And once we get rid of the lies, once we get rid of the evasions, then it's as if a burden is lifted from our shoulders. We don't have to preserve an illusion. We don't have to lie.
I think that's a perfect note. If we
I'm
take
sorry.
a little break. No,
I took-
you're great. Mark is not right up here, but we just want to, first of all, thank you so much for being here. So we're really grateful. Our gratitude to everybody for being here and being willing to start these conversations and stay for these conversations. That's exactly what you've been talking about. That's where it begins and continues. I know from what Mark said that you may be able to stick around a little bit for some more individual questions, which is why I'm sorry to be rude, but I know.
No.
But
I'm
that
happy.
may,
I just want to make sure that I can make my plane,
Yes.
and right now I can do that, so I'm
Yes.
delighted.
I also would be remiss if we didn't also thank our moderators, Joel Colburn, Paul Duran, Mary DeClue, and Cindy Rossi for being willing to and Scott Holder for moderating for our next session. So let's thank Mr. Walensky again for being here.